Hello and welcome to the Property Roundup here on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on activity on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging. This show is sponsored by daft.ie, Ireland's most visited property website. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Chris White, project manager with experience across public and private sector housing delivery, to talk about why private developers can and must play their part in delivering homes for Ireland. Chris, welcome back. Thank you for joining me again today.
Thanks very much for having me again, Carol.
Chris, I really enjoyed our conversation the last time. We got a great reaction to it. And I think part of it was because while we talk about housing delivery, while we speak to people in construction every week on the show, we're not very good at breaking down maybe some of the steps. And sometimes we assume that while we're speaking to an industry audience, we assume that everybody knows what it's like on site and delivering things, and everybody knows the process, how you get from A to B, like what happens between a grant of
Mhm.
planning to actually getting on site and thereafter. So let's see if we can get a little bit deeper into this. But I have to start. You were causing a bit of trouble on social media this week, and we love to see that. So you seemed a bit frustrated when you posted the private sector, the private developers essentially really they have to play a part in delivering homes for Ireland. What were you trying to achieve by that, or what did you mean?
Yeah, look, I suppose obviously since the last time we talked, we kind of focused on the delivery of social and affordable housing, and there's everyone has their part to play in it. So the great work that the LDA and the HBs and local authorities are contributing to that. But also, if you look at who is the biggest contributor at the moment to the delivery of housing, it's still the private sector, because they're agile, they can move fast, they can adapt quickly to market trends, and that has been beneficial to sort of scaling up the numbers of new homes that have been delivered over the last 6 years. But we have a gap at the moment between what we are currently delivering, which is roughly around 33,000 units a year, and what the central bank have said is, more realistically, we need to be delivering around 52,000 units a year for the next 25 years. So we have that gap. How do we close that gap quicker? Because effectively, it's taken us 6 years to double our delivery. So we cannot wait another 6 years. So how do we shorten it? My view is that the private sector should get there quicker. If we, I suppose, put in the right measures in place that allows them to actually increase their delivery of housing.
Okay, well, look, two things. First of all, do you accept the central bank's figures of us needing 52,000 homes per year over really the next quarter of a century? Because actually, some industry estimates would have that upwards of 60 and 64,000. So do you think 52,000 is around about the right figure?
It's it's definitely getting into the right realms of where we need to be. 33,000 was always going to be very short-sighted. If you look at our figures of people moving into the country for employment, or households are reducing down in size, so there's a requirement for more different unit types. I what I find really interesting about the central bank report was they said 52,000 for the next 25 years, or I think it was 64, 68,000 if they did it over 10. There is a little bit where you might be cautious around increasing that quickly, but potentially I'd say you got to that figure, there probably would still be a demand beyond the 10 years for that. It's one of those things that's probably going to need to be monitored more closely and adjusted as when I'm required.
Okay, and then the second question really I have is around when you talk about private developers and them having to play their part. I think maybe we need to break down, are we talking about developers? Are we talking about home builders? Are we talking about contractors? Because whenever and I don't like pitting public and private and not-for-profit sectors against each other at all, but the reality is the private sector that's delivering. It's the private sector contractors who are actually building the homes. It's
Yeah.
private sector staff and employees and supply chain on site. So where we've seen maybe the public sector and the not-for-profit sector come in and assume the role of developers, they're still completely dependent on the private sector as their supply chain. So can you just maybe break down for your experience, and I know
Mm.
you're very experienced across both public and private sector delivery, but most recently, or not necessarily most recently, but quite recently, in the social and affordable housing space. So can you just break down who's building what in terms of housing in Ireland?
I mean, look, if you look at who is got the sort of biggest output at the moment, it's the home builders, that are really sort of driving delivery at the moment, followed by developers, and then you've got sort of the LDA and the HB sector and the local authorities. But I think every element has their own part to play because, we talk about, for the HBs and the LDA, the private sector supply chain is supporting the delivery. The reality of it is those entities are facilitating the delivery as well. So they're the ones that are bringing the land together, getting the planning, design teams, getting it, a contractor appointed and getting it on site. So I think as a collective, it's good. I think though the supply chain, the private supply chain, can move faster. And I think that's how we get that increase quicker. By utilizing it. It's just how do we go about utilizing the private sector to get there faster?
And actually, that was a point that you raised in your article. And, sometimes it speeds up things to cut to the chase. And you essentially said, go big or go home on housing delivery. And so essentially, you were making the case for private sector developers to deliver large scale projects, which hasn't happened en masse in Ireland. So, how far away from that are we, or are we moving towards that model anyway?
Look, I think we are, and we've got some very good examples of where it has worked. If you look at Adamstown, Clonbarris, Cherrywood, where large scale development has taken place because we went down the SDZ route, we master planned, we put it in the right infrastructure in tandem with the developments coming online. That is probably what we're looking at in terms of being able to scale up. So there's definitely, I'm probably going to talk from a very Dublin centric perspective because I'm living in Dublin and have done for the last 20 plus years. But there's land banks within Dublin that are within inside the M50 that could become SDZs that could facilitate growth and different types of housing for different tenure types, without having to necessarily be outside the M50. However, the likes of those land banks as well have helped greatly. They just need to be around the right infrastructure in terms of road and rail and public transport and have the other services provided in tandem as well.
And well, on that, I mean, you called out planning as being, one of the hurdles. I think you referred to it as a maze to
Yeah.
be navigated, which unfortunately is accurate. And by maze, I'm referring to the dead ends that you don't know are there till you've spent 18 to 24 to 36 months getting to the end of it to realize it's a
Yes.
dead end. So has that situation improved at all? Because one perception out there, or certainly it used to be a perception, I think it's not so entrenched today, but there was a bit of a perception that the social housing sector would be able to navigate that, or get kind of a cleaner route through planning. And I think the LDA has learned that that's not necessarily the case. So
Yeah.
explain how planning has that improved at all from from a practitioner's place on the ground. Has that improved at all over the last 18 months?
What I don't know about you, but what I've noticed recently is, you had a number of SHDs that had been stuck in, sort of judicial reviews. And I'm noticing a drip feed through now where those cases have been decided, and there's occasions now where it's fallen in favor of the developer. So we're now starting to see land banks that have got planning of 100 plus units. So I do think you've that element is starting to come through. The replacement for the SHD process seems to be working better. I don't think it's a huge improvement, but it's definitely working better and it's moving in the right direction. I'm interested to see what the changes to the planning legislation over the next couple of years, how that helps facilitate it, because you've got to get to strike the balance between the greater good of the community and the provision of housing, but also listening to the local community as well and making sure that their needs, their concerns are heard, and that is fed into the planning application. I think we talked about this before, where it's important for developers or anyone working in that environment to listen to them, because most of the time you will find a way to compromise to get it through, rather than, reach a stalemate or end up going to Bord Pleanála where there's an appeal taken against the planning application.
Chris, you're definitely speaking my language here when we talk about the public consultation and community engagement element side of it, because quite frankly, I think any home builders or developers who think that that's a tick box exercise, or that's a soft skill that has to be deployed at a certain point throughout the process, if you still think that's a soft skill, then you haven't learned your hard lesson. And the reality is, particularly in the political environment we're in at the moment, but actually in the social order of the day, the reality is our communities are very angry, and they're angry for lots of different reasons, some more justified than others. But public consultation and community engagement around what happens, what's going to be built in our areas, that has moved on so much from the statutory activity. It's moved on so much from being a tick box exercise. If you cannot bring the community along, you will not get development. But when we talk about that, we assume that you're actually talking about the individuals, the people within the community. But actually, just yesterday, the same day that the central bank upped their estimates in terms of housing to 52,000, we saw a huge store of homes being refused, essentially by local councillors. So not going as far as the community. Now, you could take the view that local councillors are the community because they're the locally elected representatives and they speak for the community. But the reality is they don't go out and ask the community on every issue, on every development. So they're acting on their own judgment. And when we see local councillors stopping housing in areas of such critical shortage, then we have to wonder, when we talk about the community, are we addressing it wrong? Like, are the public representatives actually serving the community in such instances?
I think there's definitely an element of, you need to think about the communities there, but also the community that has yet to be introduced into the area, because we can't have this thing of closing the door behind and not necessarily wanting anyone else to come in to the area, particularly where you've got brownfield sites within areas that have existing infrastructure. Those are the sites that need to be developed. Those are the sites that need to be housing need to be provided on. There's definitely probably another conversation around, how do you take the pulse of the community better? How is that through more sort of online engagement? Is there a way to communicate and understand how people feel about certain things without having to knock door on door? So there's probably a way to use tech to do that in the future, and I think it's something that definitely should be explored as to how you can do that. Definitely at a local community level as well. But look, you kind of got to think about again, I keep saying the greater good and working together for the greater good, and that's probably one of those areas where you have to balance the needs of the existing, but remember there are more people that need to come into that area.
I think that's a really good point. And just one thing, just in terms of using technology or platforms to actually, essentially get a sense of how the community is feeling. There's actually a number of different technologies in place for that. And I'll declare a bias here. One of our own platforms, Place Engage, is up and running and ready to do that. And so that's a really interesting way where people can very instantaneously, in a map-based way, actually see what proposed developments are planned for their area and comment, get involved, get engaged in the conversation. So we're really introducing this two-way conversation. And one of the things you're doing there, and we talk a lot about not just us, NIMBYism is a bit of a hot topic. And while I know from experience that this not in my backyard mentality definitely exists, I also think sometimes it's used in a very lazy way by project owners to say, oh, well, they don't like it, not in my backyard, NIMBYism. But actually sometimes those people have very valid concerns. They have very real concerns. And sometimes top of the list, the concern is that we weren't listened to. So actually, the simple act of listening can go a certain amount of the way. But so I think, yes, NIMBYism exists. I think it is possibly lazy to say every community that objects to development are doing so with a NIMBY mentality, because I don't think that's the reality either. I think there's a shared responsibility on public and private sector project owners to be much more transparent about what's going to be planned, how it's going to be delivered. And I think they need to realise that actually you can't patronise the community anymore. It's not good enough, this one-way conversation where you stick something up on hoarding and expect people to feel engaged, or you circulate a video or put it up on the website and say, yeah, we've engaged with the community. Look, we put up a 90-second video there. Isn't it lovely? Includes a fly through. The reality is the conversation has to be two-way.
It definitely does. I mean, like my experience of the community engagement that I've done in the past is, it got down into the nuts and bolts of, well, what is the street lighting going to be like? Where is the parking? Is there going to be double yellow lines at the entrance? There are all these things because what you find is a lot of the things are already issues within their community. They don't want to be exacerbated. So it is that thing around street parking, the sort of safety in the community, all this sort of stuff. And if you can address those before you even go for planning, you've addressed their concerns and issues, and then it becomes part of the consent. So therefore, it has to be delivered. A lot, and that's most of the time what it is. I mean, conversations I've had around boundary treatments. What is the wall going to be like between me and this new development? And if you can answer the question for them and then you can make an adjustment to it, you've resolved the problem.
Let's talk about those. And we obviously hope they're the exceptions to the rule, that it's the minority of people. But last year, Primetime Investigates did some really good reporting around the times when planned projects are essentially held to ransom by local residents. And I thought genuinely it was a great piece of investigative journalism there and reporting. And one of the things it did is that it showed developers essentially being, again, held to ransom. And most of I think all that was portrayed in the media were private sector project owners. Does that happen? Does that happen to public sector project owners in your experience?
Not really, no, because the fact when you're in the public sector and it's a publicly funded project, it's more realized that, like, look, this is something that's been funded by government, so there's obviously more of a dialogue around, well, what are the compromises that we can get to improve the area, or lessen the impact of the development. But definitely, it did focus more on the private sector. But one of my sort of overriding concerns about that is, it does have apart from the delays that it causes, it actually has an impact on the price of property as well. So that, additional costs were being factored into those units, which would be, concerning because it's driving up the pricing again, of the limited amount of new property that we have coming online.
Do we know what the price, even an approximate estimate on what the price per property impact is? Because we actually undertook this exercise back in, I think, 2019. And at the time, we were looking at the projects that had been stalled at that stage due to public opposition. And we just looking at the South Dublin jurisdiction, we had calculated that the number of objections had essentially contributed to the cost of each new home somewhere in the region of 12,500, which means home buyers going in were going to have to spend an extra 12,500 to buy the very same property in the very same area with the very same fit out, just because there had been a series of objections that stalled and delayed the planning. And by the way, an extra 12,500 per property, that was a good result because those homes actually got built. We didn't calculate what the impact was of the homes that never got built because of these delays. So again, they're kind of 2019 stats. Do you know, are there any more up-to-date figures?
Not off the top of my head, but I would assume that, we went through a period of hyperinflation there in the construction industry post-COVID. I'd say that would be probably significantly higher at this point for projects that got delayed during that period of time as well. I mean, and it's unfortunate. And this kind of brings it back to what we were saying, where, the streamlining and, the efficiencies, the more efficiencies that we can put around getting through the planning process and getting on site all has an overall impact in increasing numbers, but also helping with the sort of costs as well.
So, right, let's talk about efficiencies. The new planning and development bill, which, while there's ostensibly some public support, the reality is it's nowhere near the radical reform that we've been promised. There was certainly a suggestion that it wouldn't be pushed through by the current government, despite the housing minister saying contrary. But actually, this week, we're told that the planning and development bill, with its hundreds of amendments now at this stage, is high on the agenda to push through. If that comes through, is that enough? It's not radical, but is it enough of reform to actually positively impact the planning process?
I think this is going to be one that time will tell. I mean, obviously, you've got people within the industry who are saying it's not enough and it's moving the dial in the right direction, but it's not moving it far enough. So I'm probably going to take an approach of let's see how this, pans out. But also, if we're accepting this, I think we probably need to look at, is there a time limit for a review? And not leave it open-ended, do we say within 3 to 5 years, do we take it, look at how it's working, do we make amendments to it again, is probably more realistic than scrapping its current format and then going back to the drawing board.
You are so reasonable. Let's see how this pans out. I am infinitely less reasonable. So I actually think the worst thing we could do now is bring something in that's a little better and just good enough, that actually means in 20 years' time we'll be exactly where we are now. I think that when a system is sufficiently broken, then you look at it from scratch. There's the law of complex systems is such that you can't simplify a complex system. You have to dismantle it and start from scratch if you want to create a simple system that works. And I worry that our planning process is just overly complex. And I think when we see a bill have hundreds of amendments within government before it goes out to the industry, I fear we have a problem looming. And, so it's definitely something that we would like to see not go ahead, so that it could actually have the time spent. The problem is trying to fix something as complex as our planning process is longer than the lifespan of a political. It's longer than a political cycle, and that's a real problem. So actually, I think it takes some real bravery to say, right, we might not get this done on our watch if we want it done right, but let's take a multi-party approach to getting it done so it actually serves Ireland for the long term. And I just worry that we don't have the political bravery or selflessness to actually get this right. And so it's something I worry about. But you're right. Look, time will tell. We don't know, but I would be much less reasonable than you are.
Well, I definitely think, if industry says, look, this needs to be started again, and it is going to take more than a 5-year cycle to actually get it right, then I would probably say, let's get it right, because there's no point in sort of repeating the issues that we've had in the past. I think the other thing as well, like, we can change the legislation, but we also need to adequately resource the local authority planning departments and An Bord Pleanála so that they can meet the timelines that are set out in it, because whilst they're gaining additional staff, they still are under resourced, and that is in itself causing delays in trying to get stuff through the planning process.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't agree with you more on that. In fact, I think there's been a lot of conversation around the need to resource An Bord Pleanála, and I agree with that. But actually, as a primary step, I would much rather some autonomy was returned to our local authorities and local authorities given greater resources as a first step, so that An Bord Pleanála becomes the backup that it was only ever meant to be, as opposed to the primary. And I think actually the people who are engaged in planning in local authorities around the country. They're the people who know their area. They're more intimately familiar with not just what needs to happen, but also how the community feels about that. So actually, even in terms of placemaking and public consultation and community engagement processes, I love the local authorities that don't just outsource their problems. They don't just outsource to an agency to come in and run all this for them, that they actually take the time to upskill, to train themselves, that they see ongoing engagement with their community as a skill they need to have across their department. And they do that. And I think the local authorities that do that well, they're the ones that we're starting to see really good public realm projects coming forward. They're getting good at accessing European funds. So they're really starting to drive improvements, the type of improvements that don't make headlines, but that make it much nicer for the people who are living in these towns and villages across Ireland. So I'd love to see greater resourcing of the local authorities at a local level, because I think that they're so much more clued in, and I think their motivation is such that they want to see the areas in which they serve, they want to see those thrive. And I think that to me would be the best chance of better planning success. And at the end of the day, you touched on it there, with the greater good, but like, planning is all about the common good, and sometimes that gets lost in our system. But look, I'm conscious of your time. You talked about efficiencies. I think efficiencies in the planning system is beyond us both, Chris. With the greatest respect in the world, I don't think all my complaining is not going to get us anywhere. But genuinely, in a constructive way, it is something we'd like to kind of address in a different way that is not through the current planning and development bill as drafted in 2023. But in the vein of driving efficiencies for actual housing delivery, you touched on in your article about increasing the use of offsite and other modern methods of construction. In your experience, and by the way, just so people are aware, the government, the NESC government think tank, has actually just released a report on offsite and other modern methods of construction today, which is available. I'm sure it'll be available on the government website there, and it's definitely worth a read. It's very welcoming and very encouraging, and actually very supportive of policies that promote and drive MMC adoption, which is great. Again, just out today, so people can take a look at that. But on the ground, are you seeing an increased use of different offsite and MMC technologies?
Yes. I mean, and it's across the board. So, if you see a lot of apartment blocks now are definitely gone down the precast route in terms of a method of sort of delivering faster. It works well, particularly in sort of brownfield inner city sites where it's difficult and challenging to deliver. In terms of your low density unit types, you're seeing a lot of, 2D volumetric paneling that's made offsite and shipped into place to give you the sort of primary structure of those units to build the envelope around and inside. And obviously that speeds things up as well. Time is of vital importance when you're trying to get units delivered on an annual basis. So, projects that I've seen over the last few years, they've definitely moved away from traditional methods of, block and brick, being built on site, and definitely moved more towards, the ICF, the volumetric paneling, the precast concrete, it's great to see. And Ireland is definitely building up skill sets in the country, which is important in order to deliver the scale that we need to do over the next few years. And I think it should continue on that way.
What are the, not necessarily points of resistance, but where are the kind of chokeholds in the system then to speed up housing delivery? And I think you made the very good point that just to get to where we are now, which is, at approximately 33,000 homes per year, like, it's taken 6 years to double that capacity. And yet we know we need to essentially close to double that, depending on whether you're looking at the 52 to the 64 range that's needed. Where will be the challenges in scaling to meet those kind of figures?
Definitely resource. I mean, look, we're you look at the central bank report, they're talking about an additional 30,000 workers are going to be needed to deliver just 52,000 units a year. And that's purely just talking about residential construction. we can build houses, but we also have to build all the other infrastructure around that as well. So we're probably going to need a significantly huge amount more of workers in the construction industry to facilitate not just residential, but all the other types of construction in Ireland. So that's definitely one thing. I think, as well, in terms of the sort of MMC stuff, we have factories within Ireland that are starting to manufacture at scale. And you do have certain home builders that have gone in and developed their own offsite manufacturing facilities in order to do this, but it needs to be scaled up. We need to look at how we can increase capacity quickly within that existing infrastructure, and then how do we support further development of new infrastructure to deliver that type of MMC.
Okay, and I suppose final point, because I'm very conscious of your time now. Thank you for being so patient with me.
Nice.
Just in terms of, you touched on it there, and I think it's such a key issue, supporting infrastructure. So, I mean, housing, yes, the industry can do so much once it gets through planning and they're actually on site. So much is within the main contractor's control and that of their supply chain, but connections to critical utilities and other
Yes.
infrastructure, that's still a problem. Is that less of a problem if you're delivering into the social and affordable housing, or is it the same problem across the board for all residential?
It's pretty much a muchness. There might be an opportunity to speed it up slightly quicker, but the public sector are very much facing the same challenges as the private sector around getting those sort of new connections done in a timely manner in order to facilitate completions. So I think both sectors definitely experience the pain. I do think it needs to be additionally resourced for the likes of Irish Water and the likes of ESB networks in order to maintain the sort of connection capacity that we need, but also not for the next 5 years, but we need to start looking at like how to resource for the next 30 to 50 years and have redundancy in place so that as areas grow, it's easier to add additional infrastructure rather than having to scrap and start again.
Final question, Chris. We're just about a week to 10 days away from budget 2025 being announced. There is a lot of speculation in the media about the resourcing of infrastructure and maybe some of the Apple windfall money being put towards infrastructure, and politically, because we're coming into a political we are in a political cycle that, there's talk
Mm-hmm.
of a potential department dedicated to I suppose dealing with infrastructure and infrastructure delivery and capital projects in Ireland. What is your take on that? Do you think another department is the way to go, or is this just another layer of bureaucracy to be navigated by public and private sector project owners?
I read the article that had been written by the Taoiseach when it came out, and I did actually find it interesting. Would it make more sense to centralize the delivery of infrastructure under one entity? And I obviously read the sort of counter arguments to that as well. Um, my view is there's a lot of really good people already working within those environments. If you take, yes, you got ASB and Irish Water, but then you've got you need to, deliver roads, you need to deliver schools, you need to deliver community facilities, shopping centers, places of employment. So everyone's doing this, but it's more probably around who and how they're communicating with each other. And I think if you can improve how they're all communicating with each other to bring infrastructure together in tandem, I think that would help and be beneficial. Because there's very much at times, things are happening side by side, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. And it's how you get to that point where everyone is communicating, being on the same page, and driving their own projects individually, but coming together collectively to do it in a timely manner.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point around the communications. However, I do remain on a team Simon Harris on this one, but time will tell. Chris, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and expertise. I hope we got a little deeper into the weeds, as people tend to like us to do. But the reality is the challenges are so entrenched, it's really difficult to see a way out. And I think because we're in a political year, we're in a time of uncertainty, which is generally a negative thing. But actually, I think in a political year, uncertainty can be a real positive thing, that actually he who shouts loudest gets heard. So therefore, the
Mm-hmm.
projects, the infrastructure that's needed, the resourcing of state bodies that would actually speed this up. You know, this is a good time. So this is the one time when we welcome uncertainty in the industry, because uncertainty can generally come down in favor of delivery. And that's what we
Yes.
want, whether it's across public or private sector. So, yeah, I think the next few weeks will tell a lot. But thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I genuinely appreciate it. That was Chris White, experienced project manager across public and private and social housing delivery. And if you do want to look at the article that I referred to at the start there, go on to Chris White's LinkedIn, and it's available publicly there. My thanks as always to producer Katie Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. Also huge thanks to our show sponsor daft.ie, Ireland's most visited property website. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Property Roundup. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows here on iPropertyRadio.com.